Man to Men is for men like me. My name is Gabe McKinney, and I'm the Executive Director of Fraternity for Beta Upsilon Chi. The Live Faithfully segment returns in a few weeks with a whole new series connecting the Bible's Proverbs collection to your cell group or men's group. Jared Musgrove is back to take listeners into one of the Bible's most popular but misunderstood books like you've never considered it before. But until then, I wanted to tell you about our new seasonal series that will run in August 2024 called Collegiate Leaders. These are honest conversations with college men who lead courageously for Christ on major campuses across the country. I get to lead often with these incredible young men, and I can't wait for you to hear from them soon. I hope you enjoy this episode.
This is Man to Men, the premier audio journal for men living faithfully and leading courageously. I'm Jared Musgrove, and we're back with you guys for the wrap-up of our first ever Live Faithfully series. This is a series designed for man-to-men discussion, equipping you to live faithfully with God and one another. And what we've been doing is walking through a section of 15 Psalms called the Psalms of Ascent, named that way because they were sung by ancient Hebrews going up, that is ascending, to worship God together in the temple in Jerusalem. And we have covered Psalms 120 through 134 on this journey, but we didn't do it alone. We did it together in community. And what you guys need to know is that this wasn't written or formed just by myself or by one person. We're actually going to talk together in community today about how this series came about, some of the things we've learned, and I'm going to do so with my co-author, Justin Elafros, who helped write this entire Psalms of Ascent series with me. Welcome back to the show, Justin Elafros.
I appreciate it, Jerry. Good to be back.
Yeah. Well, man, it's fun to get to do all kinds of projects with you these days. And this was a project that we had in gestation. I've forgotten how long we've even been working on it. But we got to pull away for quite some time, really focus in on these Psalms of Ascent, really focusing in on that idea of walking with God and one another in community, which is something that we're both very passionate about in our ministries, drawing out the theme as we've been talking here on the series about these Psalms, looking at God's acts in our own past to cause praise and gratitude in the present and prayer for the future. They really do sum up so much of a life walking with God and one another. And we spent a lot of considerable time in these Psalms together, which was honestly really fun, man. It was fun doing this in community.
Yeah. I mean, you think about the Psalms, it's such an honest book, you know, and the real life that it's so easy to engage with. And yet at the same time, I think it's one of those books that so many people, they don't tend to avoid. I just think they gloss over. They'll read it like, oh, a psalm a day or something like that. But to get down into the depths of it and to think about the fact that the Psalms of Ascent was something that was sung together in community, I just think it has a lot to teach us as we think about, you know, what it looks like for us in our Christian walk every day.
Man, I think you're right. And I think as we've talked about many times, and this is one reason we jumped into writing this together. This is a reason it's featured on Man to Men. We picked it as our first series of Live Faithfully episodes to equip men in their small groups. Why do you think that this collection of Psalms is so important in the lives of men specifically? What does it have to say to us?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. You know, following in just some of what I just said, you know, I think that we live in such a hyper individualistic perspective of life, and not just life in the world that we live, but also in our Christian life. And so even the underlining assumption here is that these are people who are walking, ascending to the temple together. And so this wasn't just something where it's just me and my own Bible or me and my own song, if you will, or me and my own psalm. But this was something that we would sing together. And I think it orients us in an appropriate way to think about our Christian life in a way where it breaks down those walls of individualism and moves towards other people. And that's why I think it's rightfully titled Walking with God and One Another. And the reason why I think it's really important for men in particular is that I think most of the time, and I think we're growing in this, I hope that we're growing in this, but I think as a broader Christian culture, we're growing in the understanding of community. But I think for men, it's harder for them to engage in that many times. And just the fact that God has a whole portion of scripture called the Psalms or songs is just so fun, because songs is something that just brings people together automatically. There's something about it that God has woven into our hearts that brings people together. And so it's almost like you think about when somebody brings in a song, you're like, oh, it's a nostalgic, you know, it's like, oh, I loved that song growing up. And you join in and it automatically breaks down those walls. And I wonder if that's what it was like for these people that were ascending towards the temple where it's like, oh, we sing this every year. We sing this together. It's nostalgic in so many ways. And so I just think it's so interesting and fascinating that God would use songs to kind of break down some of those walls. I don't know. What would you say?
No, that's so true. That's what I think drew me to the Psalms of Ascent to begin with, is that there's a lot of stories behind certain Psalms, particularly like Psalms of David. It tells you when exactly he was writing this. And some of the individual Psalms of Ascent even tell you, hey, this is a Psalm of David when he was doing this. This is a song of Solomon or Hezekiah, for one of them. But I think the thing I love that pushes them all together is that this is truly a collection. We've called it a playlist a couple times through the series. And that there's a story happening with these Psalms, that there's this movement in them kind of through all of life. You're walking through life and the rock bottom of life, which is where Psalm 120 starts, up to kind of this is the pinnacle of life when you get to 133 and 134, where you see this is what God really likes. This is how God sees us together, and just everything in between. They really are kind of the Psalms of a lifetime. And I think that they're so important to us as men for helping our imagination. That we don't just do this alone. Like you said, we've got to have God and we've got to have one another. And these Psalms, I think, give some of the picture of how we do that. I think there's a lot of practicals in them, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and I love that you brought not only the song, but also the story, that they're caught up in a story together and they're rehearsing that story towards one another. And, one of my favorite Psalms in this one is Psalm 124.
Yeah.
And the reason it says, in verse 1, it says this, I'll just read it for us. It says, if the Lord had not been on our side, let Israel say, in the verse 2, if the Lord had not been on our side when the people attacked us, then they would have swallowed us up alive in their burning anger against us. Then the water would have engulfed us. The torrent would have swept over us. The raging water would have swept over us. And then right there it says, blessed be the Lord. And I think that, you think about the stories of our own individual lives, but then the stories of our collective lives, meant to rehearse the true story that we're all caught up in, which is the true story of God redeeming the world to himself. And that we have got to, it doesn't mean that we don't have troubles and tribulation. It doesn't mean that, just what this verse was saying, that the water would not have engulfed us, right? Like there are times in my life where I feel like the water has engulfed me. Yeah. And Jared, you've been there and others have been there to help drum
through some of those waters together. Yeah,
exactly. But to rehearse the truth of the gospel together, in that sometimes I need somebody outside of myself to remind me of that story. And so much of this work in the ascending is story work, in that we're caught up in a true story. And it's the integration of my story, our story, going into God's true story.
Yeah, just rehearsing God's acts in the present and prayer for the future. That's what we've been saying at every episode. One thing I love about these Psalms is that, and I shared with you, like when we started diving into them, I got enraptured in Psalm 120, just the opening volley of these Psalms, because it's not on its face a celebrational Psalm. Like this is, you're thinking like, oh, we're going to go on a cool road trip and I made a playlist. Like that's a good thing. It actually starts with a very lonely man and a lonely Psalm. He's saying in Psalm 120, this is how the entire playlist opens up. In my distress, I called to the Lord and he answered me, which is, well, that's great, but oh, distress? And then he's saying, deliver me, O Lord, from lying lips, from a deceitful tongue. And then he walks through the fact that I can't stay where I am because I'm surrounded by people who hate peace. I've made my dwelling here too long, he says. I'm for peace, but they talk about war all the time. And he reaches this one thing I love, the real life of these Psalms when you get into them. The journey starts at rock bottom. And the man in the first Psalm is like, he's just a real guy. And he's saying, I'm in distress. And he does what I hope each of us can do, is that I called to the Lord. And there's just kind of that, this is really the only real sign of hope in it, is that he answered me. Just the whole first Psalm is really saying, this is bad. And in a sense, I'm at a turning point where I've got to decide what I'm going to do. And he decides that, hey, I'm going to go with the people of God up to worship Jerusalem. I have to leave this community I've known my entire life, essentially, because they're not walking with God. I'm now for peace. I don't know if it was a conversion or what it was, but he's just saying, I have to leave here in order to get with God, to get in with the people of God. That really, really deeply affected me. because I'm thinking about some of my own story and just past hurts, turning points in my own life. And Psalm 120 just became really, really important to me. Just seeing this man's, we talk about turning points a lot in this series, that it's a decision, an event, a person, an episode, or an experience that turned the direction of your life from where you were going to a different direction entirely. And that's what you see with this man in Psalm 120. He realizes that he is in a community that's not going in a good way, and he's got to make a change. He's got to make a change. So there's a lot of bravery, and there's just that one line, the Lord answered me. There's such confidence in it. I love Psalm 120. It gave me just a new appreciation for that psalm.
It's good. And it's one thing to talk about a turning point in your past. It's another thing to talk about a turning point in your present. And when you're in the midst of one, right? And that's when, for this man, he had to move communities in so many ways, and to decide, I'm going to go with these people over here that are ascending towards the temple, that are centering towards the Lord. And that's a really challenging thing to do, to break off some ties. Obviously, you do this over a long period of time with other people, all of that.
Yeah.
But to break off ties with some that are maybe going towards war, and I know that sounds extreme in our world, but that's essentially what is happening. And then to be able to choose a different community that he's going towards, it takes, to your point, bravery and courage.
It does. One of the other things that stood out to me was in Psalm 123, we talked about this back on that episode, but the prayer that they're praying together as a community is, show us favor, Lord, show us favor. They repeat it like that. And they said, we've had more than enough of contempt. I wonder if it's just reaching back to that Psalm 120 experience. There's a hint in these Psalms that a lot of these people who are traveling have been shown that kind of contempt by people that they maybe once walked with or trusted. And they said, we just had more than enough. And the thing that I got on there, and I think something you and I have talked about a lot that comes out in these Psalms, is that we can ask the Lord to show us favor, but that's really a wrestle for most of us as men. I don't know. We picked up on that in some of our pastoral experience in counseling, but we struggle to believe that God really likes us. And these Psalms actually say, no, he does. And you can lean into that.
Yeah. What were some of the Psalms as you were writing it, as you were doing the podcast, that resonated with you the most?
Oh, well, man, you kicked open the door on that one, because I kind of already been jumping in on that one. We're kind of covering the first part, 120 through 124. And these aren't perhaps linear Psalms. You can't necessarily track them from, this starts here and this, they're not necessarily geographic, but it's an experience that these people are having together. I really was drawn to just really a couple of them near at the end. Psalm 130, where you see a lament in confidence. And that was one of the big ideas that came out of these Psalms, is that you see that lament to begin the series of the Psalms of Ascent. You see that man beginning, and what is really a lament is like, I can't stay where I am. I have to leave. I'm calling out in my distress and the Lord's answering me. But the idea of lament and confidence is in Psalm 130, where he cries out, and you hear this community say that with this person, that out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear my voice. So this is an individual voice. It's not the community yet. And he's asking the Lord to be attentive, to pleas for mercy. He says, if you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, who could stand up against it? But with you, there's forgiveness, that you may be feared. I wait for the Lord. My soul waits. And in his word, I hope. And then he turns around to everyone else and kind of like rejoices. He says, hey guys, I've had this experience with God. And it kind of shows us how to share a very personal experience with God in community. He writes a song about it. Not all of us can do that, but he's so faithful to share this prayer that he had. Either, he's lamenting a sin that either maybe he carried with him for a while. Maybe it's like a habitual sin. Maybe it's just a hidden sin. Could have been a sin that was done to him that he's just giving over to the Lord. Maybe he's forgiving that person, or it could just be the effect of living in a sinful world. But out of the depths, he's crying. And then he turns around in Psalm 130. He says, "Oh, Israel," like in a sense, he's addressing the entire congregation that he's traveling with. He's saying, you can hope in the Lord. Like, this is the Lord we hope for, because there's steadfast love and there's plentiful redemption. I love that, where it becomes an individual lament saying, things are pretty bad. I'm pretty bad, but God, this is who he is. And then you guys should get in on it. I loved that psalm very, very much.
Oh, yeah, it's good. One of the things that I think the Israelites are really good at is looking back and having stones of remembrance, or just remembering and rehearsing the story, that what God has done for them throughout the past. And I think one of the things that we really struggle at is remembering God's faithfulness in the past. And so I think about that in Psalm 124. I think about that in Psalm 126 and many others, is that I think practicing for our own sake and for our own community's sake, gratitude from the past praise maybe for the present, gratitude for the present, and really prayer for the future, and really mapping out. And I think just one of the things that you and I defined is, the past, present, and future, and how as we look back and we see God's faithfulness, that gives us stability, that gives us faith for the present, faith for the future, and where my kids are at right now, financially where we are right now, just all the different ways that could be stressors for me, burdens for me, that I'm actually able to not only offer them to God, but then I'm also able to offer them to the community around me to help lift up my arms, lift up the burdens that I have around me, and cast them in front of the foot of the Lord. And the Psalms, I think, helps us to remember God's faithfulness in the past, the story that he's doing. I know we already mentioned that, but the story that he's already writing that we're caught up in, but then specifically the ways that he has come through for us, the ways that we can praise him, bring gratitude into the present, and prayer for the future. And so I just remember multiple times throughout all the different Psalms that we were writing about, really feeling that theme throughout. So that was one of my favorite things.
Oh, that's so good. Yeah, and there's so many themes in these Psalms. We cover community and lament and walking with God and one another, and loneliness and turning points in life, and even just house and home. I'm thinking about, I think it's a Psalm 127. You got to get into home life there and work life, all of that. What's one of those that you would hope men would walk away with? We talked a little bit about lament, but what are some of the other repeating themes that stood out to you?
Well, I think number one, I don't think we do lament well. And we have talked about it, but I think that's one of the most important things. It's one of the honesty of the scriptures that comes forward that we've lost kind of in our modern up and to the right perspective on life, and then therefore the Christian life. So I do think that's a very, very, very important one. And one of the things, I think I wrote this in, I can't remember which one of the Psalms it was. I think it was Psalm 125 or 6 was the daily examine, daily examine by St. Ignatius, and really walking through, like, bringing God, recognizing God's presence in your life right now, offering things to him that maybe are heavy burden. I know we've just talked about this, but I just think it's so important.
Right.
Offering to him those things and then asking him to do something with it, and then moving on with your day. It takes 5 to 10 minutes throughout the day, and it's incredibly impactful. Every day is not this light bulb moment that goes off, but there are times when it does, because I am a finite human,
right?
And I need to treat myself like a finite human. And for me, I have a tendency to overfunction. I have a tendency to try to meet the demand, even if the demand's too big. And so part of me walking in community and walking with God through these Psalms, through lament, is actually recognizing my finiteness, my humanness, and responding in kind. And so the daily examine has been very important to me to help me do that well. But I think another one that we really haven't talked to, it's kind of the flip side of community, is loneliness, and how powerful loneliness can be. Yeah. And it's one of those things that can feel like it traps us. It can feel like there's nothing we can do about it. And in actuality, then there is something that we can do about it, right? We can take a step forward. We can make a phone call. We can send a text. Like, there are ways that we can break out of it, but it feels so heavy upon us when we don't have people that know us deeply, and love us. And I'm reminded by that Tim Keller quote about being fully loved and fully known, and that if you don't have one without the other, it's really a sham.
Yeah.
And so how important it is to really step out towards the community of God is that really none of us are lonely. So not only with community, but also with the Lord, right? He knows us to the depths of our soul. And so it's one of those things that I think this Psalm talks about, these Psalms talk about a little bit, and how pervasive it is in our culture, and how we can break out of that. We can take a step towards one another. And I know for your audience, which is more of a younger audience, for some of you, it's right down the hall. For others of you, it's that guy in your small group. For some of you, it's just joining Bucks for the first time, because there's an opportunity for you to take that step forward. I think we've all felt loneliness here or there in our lives. And so we can all identify with that.
And I don't know that it's not as though making friends is easier when you're younger.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the great thing. That's actually the surprising thing that the Psalms of Ascent ends on, is it praises the fact that God really, really likes and anoints and uses brothers living together in unity. That's Psalm 133. And it's cool to see God's own celebration of friendship, that men were made for friendship with God and with one another. In fact, it's hard to separate the two, because we're made in the image of a triune God who is in himself, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, perfect community. And we're meant to image that with one another as men. So there's this, Psalm 133 is really just one of my favorite Psalms, which is easy because it's 3 verses. So pretty easy to memorize, right?
Yeah.
But it's the close of these Psalms as the people are, in the image of the Psalms of Ascent, maybe even arriving at the temple, ascending the steps and saying, what did all this mean? What did we learn about God? And here's what God really likes. It says, how delightfully good, or behold, how good and pleasant. Like the idea is like, look at this. This is exciting. You know what God really delights in? Rousing good friendships. I think that's how Ray Ortlund put it one time. And I think he's right. It's like you can look at this, and when brothers are dwelling together in unity or living together in harmony, seeking one another out, that's a good and godly thing. So I think even to push back on loneliness, you've got a guy here, if you look at Psalm 120, here's the journey. He feels alone. He feels cut off. He is lamenting. And then by the end of this, he's with a community that's saying, look at how good this is. So I think the challenge for us as men is not to forget how good that is. Guys, we've got listeners from collegiates to some of the guys are, eyeing retirement right now. And a lot of guys who are kind of in between right where you and I are, kind of that warrior king stage. And it can be easy to forget that one of the things God really, really loves is his men getting together. So it's worth making that push. It's worth sending that text to that guy. Maybe I haven't talked to him in a while, or maybe it's been a few years, but you can send that, you can reach out. And the Lord's really delighted when you get together. Like, I think that's so important for us to remember as men.
It's good.
Yeah. So, man, and I don't know, any final thoughts as we wrap up this Live Faithfully series on the Psalms of Ascent that you helped co-author?
Yeah. It's funny. Recently, I ran across Psalm 24, not 124, but Psalm 24, verse 3.
Oh, yeah.
And it just says, like, even to piggyback off some of what you were just talking about, it says this in verse 3, who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? So who may ascend? So it's in the same theme of what we've been talking about. Who may stand in his holy place? And verse 4, to the one who has clean hands and a pure heart. And because of Jesus, we have clean hands and a pure heart. And the only reason we can have peace with one another is because we have peace with God and because of what Jesus has done with us. And so actually loneliness is stepping outside of having peace with God, right? And one another. That Jesus says all the law and the prophets hang on this, that you would love others as yourself. And there's something that is so crucial about us living in community together, to expressing the love that God has given to us, the peace that he has given between us, and extending that to a brother in Christ. It's actually a part of spiritual warfare. And so as you were just closing up, that's one of the things that came to my mind. And I just think it's really powerful.
Oh, so good, man. Well, hey, thank you for sharing some of your insights, your work, whether the guys knew it or not. Justin Elafros has been as much a journey on this guide through this Live Faithfully series of the Psalms of Ascent as I have been. And so, Justin, thanks again for sharing this with the men.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Man to Men is powered by Beta Upsilon Chi, the nation's largest Christian fraternity, commonly referred to as Bucks. You can find out more about Beta Upsilon Chi by transliterating our Greek letters and adding a .org. That's byx.org. If you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe and share about us. Consider supporting us by clicking the individual partners link in the show notes. We are produced, rather well I might add, by the good gentleman of the Good Podcast Company. Producer Bradley's at the helm over there. Until next time, I'm Dr. Jared Musgrove with Man to Men.